In the forgotten archives of the Wisconsin Diocese lies a collection of documents the Catholic Church has attempted to bury for more than 160 years. Within those yellowed pages, stamped with seals now cracked and fading, rests an account that is as disturbing as it is unbelievable. The disappearance of 23 nuns from St. Mary's Convent, a quiet institution perched near the shores of Lake Michigan between 1854 and 1862. At the time, the convent was considered a place of discipline, devotion, and silence, but whispers from the nearby village told another story. Farmers claimed they heard screams echoing through the night air. Fishermen swore they saw cloaked figures moving across the grounds long after the bells had ceased. Yet each time someone questioned the church, the answer was always the same. Clerical errors, relocations, or misinterpretations. For decades, the mystery was dismissed, the women forgotten. But fragments of testimonies from priests, inspectors, and even surviving sisters tell a darker tale, one that suggests their vanishing was neither accidental nor holy. What you are about to hear is not merely a record of lost nuns. It is the story of a nightmare cloaked in sacred garments. The first signs of trouble at St. Mary's appeared so subtly that few dared to speak of them aloud. Father James Ryan, a young priest newly assigned to the parish in 1856, was among the first to notice. The convent's bell, once a clear and steady call to prayer, began ringing at odd hours, or sometimes not at all. Corridors that were once filled with the soft hum of hymns grew unnervingly silent. When Father Ryan visited, he found the nuns strangely distant. Their faces, once calm and bright with devotion, were pale and shadowed with exhaustion. Sister Elizabeth, known for her warm smile, now avoided eye contact, her hands trembling as she opened the convent door. More troubling still were the unexplained absences. A sister who had been seen only days earlier would suddenly vanish, her name quietly struck from the rolls, her belongings removed as if she had never existed. Locals whispered of muffled cries, drifting across the lake at night, and some swore they saw candlelight flickering in the upper windows long after curfew. Each rumor was dismissed by church officials as imagination or slander. But Father Ryan, unsettled by the evasive answers he received, began keeping private notes. In those pages, he wrote of locked hallways, of bruises he glimpsed on the wrists of certain sisters, and of an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to thicken with every passing week. Something was wrong within St. Mary's, and he feared the truth was far darker than anyone dared admit. By the winter of 1857, Father Ryan's unease had reached the ears of Monsignor Thomas Kelly, a stern but fair church official tasked with overseeing the convent. Without warning, Kelly arrived at St. Mary's for what he claimed was a routine inspection. The Mother Superior, Catherine, greeted him with politeness tinged with irritation, insisting that the sisters were in prayer and the convent had nothing to hide. Yet her composure faltered when Kelly demanded the keys to the upper dormitories. The first door he opened revealed a sight that left even the hardened Monsignor shaken. Inside a small, airless room, 3 nuns huddled together on the floor. Their habits were torn, their eyes hollow, and their hands raw from scratching at the walls. They recoiled from the sudden light, whispering prayers as if salvation had finally come. As Kelly and Father Ryan pressed further, they uncovered more locked chambers. Behind each door was another secret. A sister bound to her bed by straps, another too weak to rise from starvation, and one whose face was bruised from repeated blows. Some were incoherent, muttering fragments of scripture, while others clutched rosaries so tightly that beads had broken into their palms. The testimonies that followed were even more horrifying. The women spoke of being punished for questioning the Mother Superior, of being denied food and forced into silence. Some hinted at darker abuses, experiments with strange medicines, rituals performed at night, and pregnancies that ended in disappearance. The convent that had promised sanctuary was in truth a prison. And with each room opened, Monsignor Kelly realized that this was no matter of clerical discipline. St. Mary's hid something far more sinister, something that reached beyond the convent walls. The journals and ledgers uncovered within the convent told a story more chilling than anything Father Ryan or Monsignor Kelly had imagined. Written in a careful, almost clinical hand, they documented not only punishments, but transactions, dates, initials, coded payments, all tied to the sudden disappearance of sisters who had once walked the halls of St. Mary's. At the center of these entries were three figures: Mother Catherine, Sister Margaret, and Sister Elizabeth. To the outside world, they were the spiritual pillars of the convent, women devoted to God's service. But the records revealed another truth. They were imposters. Their real names and pasts had been erased, replaced by forged papers and carefully crafted lies. Investigators later discovered that none of them had taken official vows recognized by the diocese. Sister Margaret's ledger detailed experiments with tinctures and medicines, dosages forced upon the sisters under the guise of discipline. Notes in the margins referenced pregnancies, many ending abruptly, the outcomes unrecorded except for vague entries like transferred or delivered. And then there was Mr. Callahan, a figure mentioned in multiple testimonies. Survivors described him as a tall man with rough hands who arrived under cover of night to escort the weakened sisters away. Those women were never seen again. When questioned, Catherine dismissed him as a supplier of goods. But his name appeared in the ledgers beside sums of money and cryptic phrases such as safe delivery St. Louis or received in New Orleans. The conspiracy stretched far beyond the convent walls. Letters hidden beneath floorboards spoke of contacts in Chicago, men of wealth and influence who demanded secrecy in exchange for generous donations. Coded phrases hinted at trafficking, with nuns reduced to commodities in a network that reached across the Midwest and into the South. The true horror was no longer confined to the damp corridors of St. Mary's. It was a carefully managed operation, cloaked in the sanctity of the church. And the women who ruled within those walls were not mere tyrants. They were architects of something monstrous, something that turned faith into a mask for exploitation. By the winter of 1858, whispers about St. Mary's had begun to spread beyond the countryside. Farmers spoke of hearing cries on still nights. Children told of shadowy figures peering from barred windows, and priests from neighboring parishes quietly warned Archbishop John Hughes of New York that something was gravely wrong in Wisconsin. It was Father Thomas Ryan, however, who forced the first cracks in the walls of secrecy. Acting on a desperate note smuggled out by Sister Mary Collins, he convinced Monsignor Kelly to launch an unannounced inspection. On arrival, the inspectors were met with forced smiles and carefully prepared guest quarters, as if the convent had anticipated their visit. Catherine Murphy herself, cold yet composed, welcomed them with prayers and reassurances. But the mask slipped when Father Ryan insisted on seeing the convent's north wing, a section always locked to visitors. After hours of resistance, Kelly ordered the doors forced open. What they found silenced even the most hardened clerics. 5 gaunt women, nuns chained to iron beds in a windowless chamber. Their skin bore scars from bindings, their eyes hollow from years of darkness. The shock was immediate. One of the rescued sisters, Josephine Brady, fell to her knees sobbing, clutching Ryan's cassock and begging for her child. Between broken gasps, she revealed she had been forced into bearing a child for men of wealth, men who had purchased the sacredness of her vows. That child, she whispered, had been taken away. The convent unraveled overnight. In secret interrogations, survivors spoke of disappearances masked as transfers, of Catherine delivering captives to brothels in Chicago and New Orleans. Ledger books seized from her quarters documented payments tied to powerful names: judges, bankers, even state legislators. The conspiracy was too vast, too protected. News of the scandal could have shaken the Catholic Church in America to its core. Instead, a new horror unfolded: silence. Evidence vanished from diocesan archives. Survivors were dispersed to distant convents, sworn into obedience under threat of excommunication. Court proceedings collapsed as witnesses either disappeared or retracted their testimony. Even newspapers reporting the case found themselves pressured into softening or retracting their stories. Only fragments slipped through the cracks. A single column in the Chicago Tribune remarked bitterly, "It seems justice extends only to those without powerful friends. The men walk free, while the women remain in shame." Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret disappeared before they could be arrested. Some claimed they fled south by riverboat. Others swore they were spirited away under the protection of church officials. Their names resurfaced only in whispers: New Orleans, Havana, Mexico City, but never in courtrooms or prison cells. St. Mary's was quietly dissolved. The buildings were abandoned, left to decay until they were eventually torn down. But for those who had witnessed the horrors firsthand, forgetting was not an option. Father Ryan, in his final journal entry, wrote, "What we uncovered at St. Mary's was not merely sin, but a calculated evil, an empire built on stolen faith. The walls are gone, but their shadows remain, and unless we learn, they will rise again." The immediate exposure of St. Mary's might have ended the nightmare for some, but for the women who survived, the true struggle was only beginning. Their bodies were freed from the convent's walls, but their minds remained imprisoned by the shadows of what they had endured. The 12 nuns rescued in 1858 were quietly transferred to other convents across the country. The church claimed this was for their protection, but in truth it was to scatter them, to silence their shared voices. Each was given new assignments, told to focus on prayer, and warned not to speak of the past. For many, the silence was unbearable. Sister Claire O'Donnell, once a bright and gentle soul, had been forced under threat of punishment to assist in the restraint of her fellow sister Teresa during one of the convent's darkest nights. The guilt consumed her. In Philadelphia, where she was sent, she awoke screaming most nights, reliving the sound of Teresa's muffled cries. Her superiors punished her outbursts with penance, misunderstanding them as hysteria rather than trauma. Eventually, Claire left. Religious life altogether. Records show she spent time in an asylum before vanishing from history, her fate forever unknown. Others fared little better. Sister Maria Fitzpatrick remained within the church, but was described as unstable and prone to fits of nervous exhaustion. She was transferred to a contemplative order where interaction with the outside world was minimal. There she lived out her days in silence, dying in 1870 at only 38 years old. Her cause of death listed as nervous decline. The tragedy of Sister Josephine Brady was perhaps the most heartbreaking. She had given birth while imprisoned in the convent and was told her child would be taken away to better prospects. Once freed, Josephine begged church officials to help her find the boy, but her pleas were ignored. Separated from the only piece of love she had left, Josephine spiraled into despair. Within a year, she ended her life, leaving behind only a desperate note. "Tell my son I was not wicked, only stolen." Yet amid despair, a faint light emerged. Sister Anne Sullivan, one of the 5 women found locked in the convent's hidden chamber, refused to be silenced. Though bound by her vows of obedience, she used her position carefully, building quiet networks of support for other nuns who whispered of abuse. In letters discovered decades later, she wrote of her mission: "We must distinguish between God and those who wear his robes falsely. Our task is to ensure no other convent becomes another St. Mary's." Though the church never officially recognized her efforts, Anne became a hidden champion for victims of clerical abuse, planting seeds of resistance that would not bear fruit. Until generations later, the trauma of St. Mary's rippled outward. Families of missing daughters carried unanswered questions for decades. Local children who once saw the sad women in black at the windows grew old, passing down, whispered, stories of screams carried on the wind. Even among those who had never set foot inside the convent, the memory lingered like a curse. The survivors carried two truths, one of unbearable suffering and one of extraordinary endurance. They were not merely victims, they were women who lived through the unimaginable and, in their own ways, bore witness to it. Some faded into silence, some were broken by the weight, and some, like Sister Anne, transformed their pain into quiet defiance. What united them all was the shadow of St. Mary's, a shadow that followed them until their final breaths, a reminder that freedom does not erase horror, and that scars, carved in faith, are the hardest to heal. The downfall of St. Mary's should have been the end of the nightmare. Yet, as investigators soon realized, the convent was not an isolated pocket of evil. It was a gateway into something far larger, a network of corruption that stretched across cities, states, and into the highest corridors of power. In late 1858. Only weeks after the convent's exposure, Chicago police carried out raids on 3 so-called houses of charity. Behind their respectable facades, authorities found not orphans and widows, but brothels filled with women in torn habits and soiled gowns. 9 former nuns and 13 young women were rescued that night. Their stories matched those from St. Mary's in chilling detail, threats cloaked in scripture, beatings disguised as penance, and the systematic trafficking of women whose vows of purity had been twisted into a commodity. One survivor, known only as M.L., in police records, gave a testimony that linked her directly to St. Mary's. She said Mother Catherine herself had escorted her to Chicago in 1856. Before leaving, Catherine whispered that if she ever attempted escape, both church and law would brand her a fallen woman and cast her aside. For nearly 2 years, M.L. believed it. The raid should have exposed powerful men, for the ledgers seized contained names, bank presidents, judges, businessmen, even 2 state legislators. Each had paid to violate women who were seen as sacred. Yet, when the cases went to court, something strange happened. Witnesses vanished or recanted. Evidence disappeared from locked rooms. Judges issued baffling procedural rulings that collapsed prosecutions before they could begin. Within months, the scandal was buried beneath layers of silence and shame. The Chicago Tribune voiced the frustration of many when it printed, "It appears that justice in our city extends only to those without powerful friends. The men walk free while the women remain condemned." Even more chilling was what happened in St. Louis. Monsignor Kelly, who had been the first to confront the horrors of St. Mary's, followed whispers that as many as 7 missing nuns had been trafficked there. He arrived in 1859, determined to push further. But within days, he was ambushed by masked assailants. Beaten nearly to death, he was warned to return to New York if he valued his life. Archbishop Hughes, fearful for Kelly's safety, recalled him immediately. The investigation ended before it had truly begun. Decades later, when Kelly's private letters were unsealed, his words revealed the depth of what he had uncovered. "We have glimpsed only the visible edge of a far greater darkness. Its tentacles reach into the highest levels of society, and, I fear, even into the church itself. Powers beyond our reach have decreed that no further truth will be permitted." The survivors bore the greatest weight of suppression. Scattered across convents, silenced by obedience or dismissed as hysterics, they had no platform to speak. Society preferred the myth of pure and holy sisters to the reality of their suffering. The church, desperate to shield itself from scandal, allowed the machinery of power to grind their voices into silence. But the fragments refused to disappear entirely. Newspapers carried whispers. Local families passed down stories. Farmers told their children of the nights when the wind carried screams from the convent's north wing. These memories, fragile but persistent, kept alive the truth that authorities worked so hard to erase. St. Mary's was not just a single place of horror. It was part of a pattern, an organized exploitation hidden beneath religious robes, protected by the wealthy and silenced by institutions meant to protect the innocent. The convent's fall was merely the tearing of one curtain in a much larger theater of shadows. When St. Mary's was finally shuttered in disgrace, many expected Mother Catherine, the woman whose iron grip had ruled the convent, to stand trial. Yet, when officers came with warrants in the spring of 1859, the abbess was gone. Her quarters, once filled with ledgers, letters, and coded journals, had been stripped bare. Only a crucifix nailed upside down above her bed remained, as if left. As a taunt, witnesses claimed Catherine was last seen boarding a carriage at dusk, flanked by two men in clerical garb. The driver whipped the horses westward, and from that moment, she was never officially seen again. Some whispered she fled to St. Louis under the protection of high-ranking clergy. Others swore she disguised herself as a laywoman and sailed for Europe. A handful of survivors insisted she had not fled at all, but had been removed by the same men who once protected her, silenced to prevent further scandal. If Catherine's disappearance was mysterious, Sister Margaret's was even more unsettling. Margaret, once her closest confidant, had shown signs of unraveling in the final months. Records note her pacing the convent halls at night, whispering to herself, scribbling lines of scripture that devolved into incoherent ramblings. After the convent closed, she was placed in a small sanatorium near Milwaukee. But, according to staff, logs on a rain-soaked night in October 1860, Margaret simply vanished. Her cell door remained locked from the outside, and no signs of forced exit were found. The only clue was a smear of candle wax across the wall, forming the crude outline of a cross. Some claimed she had been taken, spirited away by the same network that had hidden Catherine. Others believed she had lost herself entirely, slipping into madness so complete that she wandered into the woods and never returned. Rumors flourished. Local farmers claimed to see a gaunt woman in a torn habit wandering the fields at night, her eyes wide and unblinking. Children whispered of a shadowy figure who sang broken hymns at the edge of the lake. And in 1862, a fisherman reported pulling a sodden rosary from his nets, its beads tangled with human hair. Neither woman was ever found. Their names remained unspoken in official church records, their crimes buried, their victims silenced. Yet among the scattered survivors, the legend of their vanishing became both a curse and a warning. To them, Catherine and Margaret were not just fugitives but specters, embodiments of the evil that had thrived in St. Mary's. To this day, their fates remain among the convent's greatest mysteries. Did Catherine live out her days in hidden luxury, shielded by powerful allies? Did Margaret wander until madness claimed her in some lonely hollow? Or were both women erased by the very machine that once empowered them, their existence snuffed out so that silence could reign? What is certain is this: their disappearance ensured that the full truth of St. Mary's was never brought to light. Without their testimony, or their punishment, the darkest chapters of the convent were left to rot in rumor and shadow, feeding a legacy that has refused to die. After the shuttering of St. Mary's, the abandoned convent stood like a scar against the Lake Michigan shoreline. Its stone walls, once meant to represent purity and devotion, became a grim monument to secrecy and suffering. Locals avoided it, yet its shadow remained impossible to ignore. The stories began almost immediately. Fishermen swore that at night, when fog drifted thick across the lake, they could hear the toll of the convent's bell, though the tower had long been stripped of its clapper. Farmers reported seeing dim candlelight flicker in the upper windows, even though the building was locked and boarded. And children dared one another to creep near the iron gates, where they claimed to hear the muffled sound of weeping from within. Survivors scattered far from Wisconsin, but their memories bled into the community's folklore. By the 1870s, locals spoke openly of the Wailing Sisters of St. Mary's. Some said these were the souls of the 23 who had vanished, doomed to wander the halls until justice was done. Others insisted the figures were not victims at all, but the lingering presence of Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret, guarding their secrets with malevolent jealousy. In 1884, a group of railway workers repairing tracks near the convent reported seeing a woman in a torn black habit standing at the edge of the woods. When they approached, she turned and vanished, leaving only a rosary pressed into the mud. Years later, that same rosary was displayed briefly in a local tavern before disappearing into a private collection. The stories grew darker with each telling. Travelers along the lakeshore claimed to hear hymns sung in discordant tones, echoing across the water at midnight. Hunters spoke of stumbling upon shallow depressions in the soil that resembled graves, though when dug, they revealed nothing but roots and stones. Even skeptics admitted that something heavy lingered in the air around the convent grounds, a suffocating presence that made the hairs on the neck rise. By the early 1900s, paranormal investigators began visiting the site. Some recorded unexplained knocks, sudden drops in temperature, and whispers caught faintly on wax cylinders. A Milwaukee journalist who spent a night in the convent's ruins wrote of a chilling moment when the chapel door swung open on its own, followed by the faint scent of burning wax and iron. He ended his article with the line, "If hell has an echo, it lingers here." Not all accounts came from outsiders. Local families continued to claim strange happenings. A farmer's wife in 1923 reported that her daughter returned from picking berries near the convent with her hands covered in bruises, as though seized by invisible fingers. In the 1940s, two brothers fishing at dawn swore they saw a procession of women in habits walk silently across the water before dissolving into mist. Though decades have passed, the legend has never faded. Even now, ghost tours whisper of the lost nuns of St. Mary's, and thrill-seekers sneak onto the overgrown grounds searching for signs of the past. Many emerge shaken, unable to explain the cold drafts, the disembodied footsteps, or the sense of unseen eyes watching from the broken windows. Whether these hauntings are the restless souls of the missing, the echo of trauma etched into stone, or simply stories spun from fear. One truth remains: St. Mary's will never be forgotten. The convent may have been abandoned, but its horrors live on in memory, myth, and shadow, an eternal reminder of what was suffered and of what still lingers in the dark. By the dawn of the 20th century, St. Mary's had crumbled into ruin. The convent's walls sagged with ivy, its roof caved in places where storms had battered it for decades. To casual passers-by, it was nothing more than another forgotten relic of the frontier era. Yet, to those who remembered, or whose families had whispered the truth, it was a wound that never healed. What made St. Mary's endure was not just the physical ruin, but the silence that followed it. Officially, there was no record of the 23 missing nuns. Their names had been erased from church registries, their graves never marked, their existence folded into the convenient explanation of clerical error. The reports written by Father James Ryan, Monsignor Kelly, and Inspector O'Connell were sealed in diocesan vaults, dismissed as misinterpretations. Even newspaper accounts, once bold in their accusations, grew quieter over time, until they too vanished. From archives as if clipped away by unseen hands. For the families of the missing, silence was a second tragedy. Mothers who wrote to the diocese asking after their daughters received polite letters explaining that their child had transferred elsewhere or that illness had claimed her. Fathers who traveled to Milwaukee demanding answers were turned away. By priests who urged them to accept God's will, no graves were shown, no proof was given. Only shadows and evasions. By the mid-1900s, the convent had become a site of fascination for historians and folklorists. Yet their efforts met the same brick wall. Requests for church files were denied. Diaries that might have offered answers disappeared from libraries. A Jesuit scholar in 1937, who announced he had found evidence of a systemic cover-up, died suddenly of pneumonia days before publishing his findings. His notes, according to his assistant, vanished from his office overnight. Still comma fragments slipped through. In the 1960s, a box of correspondence was uncovered in a farmhouse attic near Racine. The letters, penned by Father Ryan himself, described in stark detail the bruises on the sisters, the locked chambers, the whispering at night. One line stood out above all others. The church may bury their names, but the earth itself remembers their cries. Modern researchers have attempted to untangle the mystery, but they face a labyrinth of half-truths. Parish maps from the 1850s show extensions to St. Mary's that later plans omit. Oral histories collected from descendants of local families mention shallow graves unearthed during farming, bones hastily reburied with no inquiry. Paranormal investigators claim the convent's ruins radiate an energy that feels less like haunting and more like resistance, the refusal of memory to be erased. For survivors, the reckoning never came. Those who lived carried their scars quietly, punished for speaking, ignored when they tried to seek justice. Their deaths went unmarked by history books. Their tormentors, shielded by wealth and position, passed into old age with their reputations intact. And so, the silence hardened into something worse than neglect. It became complicity. Yet silence is never absolute. The whispers of St. Mary's continued in taverns, farmhouses, and fishing boats. They grew into folklore, then into cautionary tales, until finally they bled into the investigations of modern scholars determined to pull the truth back into the light. Each rediscovered diary, each unearthed letter, each whispered legend is another crack in the wall of suppression. The final reckoning, then, has not yet arrived. It waits in the archives, still locked, in the ruins still standing by the lake, in the unmarked graves that locals claim lie hidden beneath the soil. Until those truths are uncovered, the convent's story is unfinished. What St. Mary's left behind was more than horror. It was a mirror. A mirror showing how institutions sworn to holiness can become engines of cruelty when power is unchecked, and how silence can wound as deeply as any chain. The 23 women who vanished between 1854 and 1862 may never have their names restored, but their story endures in shadows, whispers, and echoes that refuse to die. Their suffering became legend, their silence became haunting, and their memory, though buried, still rises with the fog over Lake Michigan. Because some truths, no matter how fiercely suppressed, cannot stay buried forever.